Friday night in Britain once had a rhythm all its own. The wage packet came home, the long week of graft was finally done, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something a little special. Long before the curry house, the pizza box, and the kebab shop lined every high street, families gathered round for suppers made from scratch, cheap, filling, and heavy with memory. We're counting down 25 forgotten Friday night suppers that quietly vanished when the takeaway took over. Which one tops the list? Let's begin the countdown with number 25. Number 25. Egg and chips was the supper that asked almost nothing and gave back a great deal. When the wage packet had worn thin by Friday tea time, a housewife could crack 2 eggs into a pan of spitting dripping and fry a mound of chips cut from a few pennyworth of potatoes. By the late 1950s, National Food Survey figures showed eggs and potatoes among the most reliable staples in the working-class larder, precisely because they cost so little and filled so much. The frilled, crisp-edged white and the soft yolk broken over golden chips needed no recipe, only a hot pan and a steady hand. Children mopped the plate with bread and butter, fathers shook on the salt and vinegar, and no one felt they'd gone without. It survived on plates for decades. Yet as the chippy on the corner and, later, the takeaway made frying someone else's job, the humble homemade version slipped quietly out of the Friday routine. Number 24. Beans on toast was the emergency supper that became a beloved ritual in its own right. Heinz had been selling tinned baked beans in Britain since 1901, and by the 1950s, a single tin, costing only a few pence, could stretch across a whole family with enough thick-cut toast to soak up the sauce. On a Friday when funds ran short before payday cleared, beans on toast was the meal that never let anyone down. The smell of the beans warming in the pan, the scrape of the toaster, and the pool of orange sauce creeping to the edge of the plate were the taste of an ordinary British evening. Some homes added a knob of butter melting into the toast, others a shake of pepper or a grating of cheese. Ministry of Food leaflets had once praised the pulse as cheap protein, but as fried takeaways promised more excitement for a few coins more, beans on toast retreated from the main event to a hurried standby. Number 23. Spam fritters carried the memory of wartime tins into the peacetime kitchen, a Friday treat born of American supply lines and British thrift. Housewives sliced the pink luncheon meat thick, dipped each piece in a simple flour and water batter, and lowered them into hot fat until the coating puffed golden and crisp. A single tin, bought for around $1 in the 1950s, could feed a family with chips and a spoon of peas alongside. The sizzle. As the fritters hit the pan and the salty, savory smell drifting through the scullery told children that Friday tea was nearly ready. For many, spam fritters were the affordable cousin of the fish supper, the cheaper way to eat something fried and filling at the end of the week. Yet as fresh meat grew plentiful and the takeaway offered proper battered cod, the tinned fritter came to feel like making do rather than treating oneself, and it faded from the table. Number 22. Sardines on toast were the smallest of luxuries dressed up as supper. A flat tin of sardines in oil or tomato sauce cost only a few pence, and by the early 1950s, it sat in nearly every pantry as insurance against a lean Friday. Housewives tipped the little fish onto hot buttered toast, mashed them lightly with a fork, and finished the lot under the grill until the edges caught and crisped. The oily richness of the fish soaked into the bread, and a squeeze of vinegar or a pinch of pepper lifted the whole thing. Children either loved the strong, salty tang or pushed it firmly to the side of the plate. It was a supper that honored the Friday fish tradition without the cost of the fishmonger's slab. But as tastes turned toward the deep-fried and the exotic, the tinned sardine lost its place, remembered now mostly by those who grew up cracking the little key round the top of the tin. Number 21. Welsh rarebit turned a heel of cheese and a slice of bread into something that felt almost grand. Housewives melted grated cheese with a splash of milk or beer, a spoon of mustard, and a shake of Worcestershire sauce, then poured the thick, savory mixture over toast and set it under the grill until it bubbled and blistered brown. For the price of a little cheese and a slice of bread, a family could sit down to a hot, rich supper on a Friday night when money was tight. The smell of grilling cheese filled the kitchen, and the first cut released a soft, molten center that no plain cheese on toast could match. Older Britons still argued fiercely over whether it should carry ale or Worcestershire, and whose recipe was best. Yet the fiddly saucepan and the careful grilling could not compete with convenience, and as the takeaway took over Friday, the proper rarebit dwindled to a fond memory. Number 20. Cheese and potato pie was the meatless Friday supper that anchored countless northern tables. Housewives layered mashed potato with grated cheese and softened onion, sometimes topped with a scattering of extra cheese, then baked the dish until the top turned golden and the edges crisped. It cost only pennies to make, leaning on the two cheapest and most dependable ingredients in the house, yet it emerged from the oven as comforting as any roast. On a Friday when Catholic households and thrifty families alike avoided meat, this pie stood in proudly as the centerpiece. Children scraped the crusty corners, and the smell of baked cheese and onion promised warmth against the coming weekend cold. Served with a spoon of baked beans or a heap of pickled beetroot, it was a supper that filled every seat for next to nothing. As frozen meals and takeaways spread, the homemade cheese and potato pie slipped quietly from the weekly ritual. Number 19. Corned beef fritters stretched a single tin of Argentine beef into a Friday feast. Housewives sliced the dense pink corned beef into thick rounds, dipped them in batter, and fried them until the coating turned crisp and golden, while the meat within grew hot and savory. By the early 1950s, tinned corned beef arrived on British docks by the 100,000 tons, and its low price made it a fixture in the working-class larder. A single tin, opened with that familiar little key, could be transformed into a plateful of fritters with chips alongside, a cheap echo of the fried fish supper. The smell of frying batter and the salty tang of the beef filled the scullery, and children eyed the pan long before the plates were down. Yet as fresh meat became affordable and the chippy offered grander fried fare, the corned beef fritter came to seem a relic of harder days and slipped from Friday tables. Number 18. Pilchards on toast were the working man's answer to a proper fish supper, cheap, filling, and unmistakably Friday. A tin of Pilchards in tomato sauce, caught off the Cornish coast and sold for pennies, could feed a family piled onto thick slices of toast. Housewives warmed the fat little fish in their sauce, mashed them across the bread, and served them steaming, the rich tomato soaking into the crust. For coastal towns and inland terraces alike, the Pilchard was the fish that ordinary wages could always afford. The strong, oily flavor divided households, with some children fleeing the smell and others asking for seconds. Oral histories from the West Country recall the tinning sheds and the fishing boats returning heavy with the catch. But as the Cornish pilchard fishery declined and takeaways offered fresh, battered fish for a little more, the tinned pilchard supper faded, its memory tied now to the smell of a warming tin on a Friday evening. Number 17. Fish paste sandwiches were the lightest of Friday suppers, a jar of concentrated fish spread turning plain bread into something savory and satisfying. By the 1950s, potted and pasted fish sat in nearly every pantry, sold cheaply in small glass jars that lasted for weeks. Housewives spread the salty, intense paste thinly across buttered bread, sometimes with a slice of cucumber or a scrape of tomato, and cut the sandwiches into neat triangles for a supper that needed no cooking at all. On a Friday evening, when the cook was weary and the budget spent, this was the meal that filled a gap without a single pan to wash. Children either relished the strong, fishy tang or wrinkled their noses and asked for jam instead. Ministry-era thrift had made the jarred paste a household constant. Yet as the takeaway rose and fresh sandwich fillings multiplied, the old fish paste jar retreated to the back of the cupboard. Number 16. Tinned salmon salad was the Friday supper that dressed thrift in its Sunday best. A tin of pink salmon, kept for a special evening, was tipped onto a plate of crisp lettuce, sliced tomato, cucumber, and a spoon of salad cream, a supper that looked far grander than it cost. By the 1950s, tinned salmon was the affordable luxury of the working-class larder, brought out on Fridays and high days when a family wanted to feel it had eaten well. The soft pink flesh, flaked over the greens and glossed with salad cream, carried a whiff of celebration that plainer suppers could not. Children picked out the little vertebrae, and mothers arranged the plate with quiet pride. For many, salmon salad was the taste of the weekend beginning. Yet as fresh fish and restaurant meals grew common, the tinned salmon salad lost its shine, remembered now as the modest treat that once crowned a Friday tea. Number 15. Rissoles were the clever Friday trick that turned Sunday's leftovers into a fresh supper. Housewives minced whatever cold meat remained from the week's roast, bound it with mashed potato, breadcrumbs, and a beaten egg, then shaped the mixture into flat cakes and fried them until crisp and brown. It was a dish built entirely on waste-nothing thrift, a way to stretch the last scraps of a joint into a filling meal that cost almost nothing more. The smell of frying meat and onion drifted through the kitchen, and the crisp outer shell gave way to a soft, savory center. Served with gravy, peas, and a heap of mash, rissoles fed a family on the memory of meat rather than the expense of it. Oral histories recall the pride in a well-seasoned rissole and the quiet economy it represented. As convenience foods and takeaways made leftovers seem hardly worth the trouble, the humble rissole faded from Friday plates. Number 14. Kippers filled the Friday kitchen with a smoke that clung to the curtains for hours. These split, salted, and smoked herrings, sold cheaply from the fishmonger and the market stall, were grilled or gently poached and served with a knob of butter melting into the flesh. By the 1950s, the kipper was among the most affordable fish in Britain, a proper Friday supper for families who could not stretch to fresh cod. The strong, smoky aroma announced the meal long before it reached the table, and the delicate work of picking the little bones from the amber flesh was a ritual in itself. Served with brown bread and butter, the kipper was breakfast and supper alike across the herring towns of the coast. Oral histories recall the smokehouses and the boats returning heavy with silver herring. Yet as the herring stocks collapsed and the takeaway rose, the kipper's strong flavor and fiddly bones sent it into decline. Number 13. Scotch eggs began life as a portable supper and became a Friday favorite in their own right. A hard-boiled egg was wrapped in a thick coat of sausage meat, rolled in breadcrumbs, and deep-fried until the crust turned deep golden and crisp. Housewives made them in batches, cutting each in half to reveal the ring of pale yolk at the center, a small marvel of the working kitchen. Sold cheaply by butchers and made at home for even less, the Scotch egg was filling enough to satisfy a hungry family and sturdy enough to pack for a Friday night shift or a weekend outing. The smell of frying sausage meat and the crunch of that breadcrumb shell made it a supper children genuinely looked forward to. Served cold with pickle or hot with chips, it stretched an egg and a little sausage meat a long way. As shop-bought and takeaway versions multiplied, the homemade Scotch egg quietly slipped from the weekly routine. Number 12. Bubble and squeak with a fried egg on top was the Friday supper that closed the circle on the week's leftovers. Cold potato and cabbage from earlier in the week were mashed together and fried in dripping until the edges crisped and browned, then crowned with a fried egg whose soft yolk ran down into the crackling vegetable cake. The name came from the sound of the vegetables hissing and protesting in the hot pan, a familiar Friday soundtrack in the post-war scullery. It cost next to nothing, leaning entirely on scraps that would otherwise have gone to waste, yet it filled every plate with warmth and crunch. Children fought over the crispiest brown bits, and fathers swore the corner pieces were the finest part. Ministry of Food campaigns had long praised such thrift. But as leftovers came to seem hardly worth saving in an age of plenty and takeaways, the fried egg bubble and squeak supper. Number 11. Liver and bacon was the iron-rich Friday supper that mothers pressed on their children whether they liked it or not. Slices of lamb or pig liver were fried quickly, with rashers of bacon and a heap of soft, caramelized onions, then served with mashed potato and a pool of thick gravy. Liver cost a fraction of the price of steak in the 1950s, making it the affordable route to a proper meaty supper at the end of the week. Speed was everything, for a minute too long in the pan turned the liver tough and bitter. Children wrinkled their noses at the strong, metallic smell, but parents insisted on clean plates, knowing the liver was rich in the iron and vitamins that a growing family needed. Oral histories recall the sizzle of the pan and the arguments over the crispiest onions. As sealed supermarket packs replaced the fresh butcher's slice and takeaways lured families away, liver and bacon slipped from the Friday menu. Number 10. Faggots and peas carried the taste of thrift from the Midlands to tables across Britain, a supper that made a virtue of the cheapest cuts. Butchers mixed pig's liver, heart, and belly with breadcrumbs, onion, and sage, shaped the mixture into round balls, and baked them until the kitchen filled with a rich herbal steam. Served with mushy peas and thick onion gravy, faggots stretched a shilling into a proper Friday feast. By the late 1950s, faggot shops dotted the Black Country, their windows steamed and their counters crowded with workers seeking a cheap, filling supper on payday. Children watched mothers ladle the gravy over the peas, soaking every last one, while fathers claimed the crispest faggot from the dish. Oral histories recall the secret blend of seasonings guarded by each family and shop. Yet as shrink-wrapped versions and takeaways spread, the proper faggot faded, its everyday place at the Friday table largely surrendered to convenience. Number 9. Kedgeree. Kedgeree brought a whisper of empire to the ordinary British supper table. This mix of flaked smoked haddock, boiled rice, hard-boiled egg, and a gentle warmth of curry powder had travelled home from colonial India and settled into the national kitchen. Housewives poached the haddock in milk, flaked it through the buttery rice, folded in quartered eggs, and finished the dish with a scatter of parsley. By the 1950s, Kedgeree was as likely to appear at a Friday supper as at a Sunday breakfast, a way to make cheap, smoked fish feel almost exotic. The mild spice and the soft, comforting rice made it a favorite even with cautious children, and its golden color brightened a gray evening. Oral histories recall it as the dish that made a modest fish go a very long way. But as genuine takeaway curries arrived to offer bolder flavors, the gentle old Kedgeree came to seem quaint and slowly disappeared from Friday plates. Number 8. Poached smoked haddock, gently cooked in a pan of milk, was the quietly elegant Friday fish supper of countless British homes. The pale gold fillet, often the naturally smoked finnan haddock of the Scottish coast, was slid into simmering milk and poached until it flaked at the touch of a fork, then lifted onto a plate with a knob of butter and a grinding of pepper. Sometimes a poached egg sat on top, its yolk mingling with the buttery milk. By the 1950s, smoked haddock was among the most trusted of Friday fish, affordable and forgiving, its smoky richness needing little more than bread and butter alongside. The smell of fish poaching in milk was, for many, the very scent of Friday tea time. Oral histories recall the careful search for stray bones and the comfort of that soft, smoky flesh. As the takeaway offered fried fish with no cooking required, the gentle poached supper slipped away. Number 7. Fish cakes were the thrifty Friday supper that made a little fish feed a whole family. Housewives flaked cooked white fish or tinned salmon into mashed potato, seasoned the mixture with parsley and pepper, shaped it into rounds, coated them in breadcrumbs, and fried them until crisp and golden. It was a dish built on economy, stretching a modest amount of fish across the table with the help of humble potato. The crisp outer shell gave way to a soft, savory center and served with peas and a wedge of lemon. The fish cake felt like a proper Friday meal for a fraction of the fishmonger's price. Children who balked at a whole fillet happily ate the crisp little cakes, and mothers made them in batches to see the family through the weekend. Oral histories recall them as the clever answer to Friday's fish tradition on a tight budget. As ready meals and takeaways multiplied, the homemade fish cake quietly retreated. Number 6. Winkles, cockles, and whelks made a proper seafood tea, the shellfish supper that once crowned the Friday and Sunday table in coastal towns and East End terraces alike. Sold by the pint from market stalls and barrows, these little shellfish were boiled and eaten with a pin to winkle the meat from the shell, dressed with a shake of vinegar and a sprinkle of pepper. By the 1950s, a seafood tea of winkles, cockles, whelks, and brown bread and butter was an affordable Friday indulgence, the taste of the seaside brought home. The ritual of picking each morsel free with a pin turned supper into a slow, sociable affair, the plates growing high with empty shells. Oral histories from the East End and the seaside towns recall the shellfish stalls and the Sunday best trays of winkles. Yet as tastes changed and the takeaway offered fried convenience, the fiddly seafood tea faded, its shells and pins now a distant memory. Number 5. Toad in the hole stood out as the playful, filling answer to Friday thrift, a dish that turned a handful of sausages into a meal for the whole family. Housewives poured a simple batter of flour, eggs, and milk around the sausages in a hot, fat-slicked tin, then watched it rise and crisp at the edges while the middle stayed soft and golden. Sausages, cheap and plentiful, became the star not by their number, but by the magic of the Yorkshire pudding batter that surrounded them. The sizzle of fat and the smell of baking batter filled the kitchen, and fights broke out over the crisp corners where batter met tin. Poured over with thick onion gravy, it was a Friday supper that made scarcity taste like celebration. Oral histories recall the laughter and squabbles around the table. As the takeaway rose to claim Friday night, the homemade toad in the hole slowly faded from everyday kitchens. Number 4. Cottage pie and its cousin shepherd's pie were the comforting Friday suppers that hid the week's economies beneath a golden crust of mash. Housewives browned minced beef or lamb with onion, simmered it in gravy, spread a thick layer of mashed potato on top, and baked the dish until the peaks turned crisp and brown. It was a supper built for stretching a little meat a long way, the mince bulked with onion and gravy and topped with cheap, filling potato. The smell of the pie baking, the crackle of the crust, and the first spoon breaking through to the savory meat below were the taste of a warm Friday evening. Children scraped the crispy edges, and mothers made the pie big enough to see the family through into the weekend. Oral histories recall it as the dependable supper that never disappointed. As frozen ready meals and takeaways offered the same comfort without the work, the homemade pie's place at the Friday table shrank. Number 3. Sausage and mash, the beloved bangers and mash, was the Friday supper that combined the cheapest comforts into something genuinely cherished. Fat pork sausages were fried or grilled until deep brown and glistening, then piled onto a mound of buttery mashed potato and drowned in thick onion gravy. By the 1950s, sausages were among the most affordable meats in Britain, a few of them enough to satisfy a hungry family on a Friday when the wage packet had thinned. The smell of sausages spitting in the pan and onions softening in the gravy was, for millions, the very scent of home. Children mashed the potato into the gravy and lined the sausages up to save the best for last. Oral histories recall it as the supper that made an ordinary Friday feel like a small reward. Yet as the takeaway drew families out for their Friday treat, the homemade plate of bangers and mash slowly lost its weekly crown. Number 2, the homemade meat pie was the Friday supper that turned the humblest cuts into a golden-crusted triumph. Housewives lined tins with pastry, filled them with chunks of cheap stewing beef, diced potato, and thick onion gravy, then baked the pie until the crust turned deep gold and the filling bubbled through the vents. In homes across the North and the Midlands, a proper Friday pie was a badge of pride, each cook certain her pastry was the finest on the street. The smell of baking meat and pastry drifted through the terrace, a signal that the week's work had earned its reward. Children queued for a slice with peas and gravy, eating straight from the plate. Oral histories recall the fierce loyalty to a mother's or a local baker's pie. Yet as the takeaway and the shrink-wrapped supermarket version arrived to do the work for a few coins, the everyday homemade pie faded from Friday life. And finally, in first place, fish and chips reigned as the undisputed king of the British Friday night supper. Before it became the domain of the corner chippy alone, countless families fried their own at the kitchen range, coating fresh white fish in a crisp batter and lowering it into hot dripping beside a pan of hand-cut chips. Friday was fish night by long tradition, and the fish supper was its glorious centerpiece. Cheap enough for the working family, yet special enough to mark the end of the week. The smell of frying batter filled the whole house, and the first bite through the crisp golden shell to the flaking white fish within was the taste of Friday itself. Doused in salt and malt vinegar, wrapped in a memory of newspaper, it was the meal every child longed for. Oral histories recall the queue at the chippy and the treasured supper carried home warm against the chest. It was fish and chips, more than any other dish, that the rise of the curry house, the pizza box, and the kebab shop finally displaced. The takeaway that conquered Friday night had, in the end, simply taken the nation's oldest Friday treat and made it someone else's job. From egg and chips at number 25 to the mighty fish and chips at the very top, these 25 forgotten Friday suppers tell one story above all, of families who turned little into plenty, who marked the end of a hard week with something warm and homemade, and who filled every seat at the table for next to nothing. The takeaway won Friday night in the end, but the smell of these suppers lingers still. Which one did your family make? Let me know down in the comments.